Rachel Love reporting for Health Academy News, and this is the Eugenics Report. Tonight's report is Eugenics in America. Eugenics was a controversial movement and social initiative that sought out better breeding with the goal of improving the human population by attempting to eradicate genes that were believed to be detrimental to society. During the movement, people would be sterilized against their will for factors such as poverty, disease, and crime. The idea behind the forced sterilizations was that human genetics held the key to improving human life.
Tonight, a report on a really disturbing chapter in our history, one that's a lot more recent than you might think. Did you know that at one point in the United States, more than half the states had forced sterilization laws? We're talking about eugenics, a word which is obviously typically associated with Nazi Germany. But there was a large eugenics movement in America before and after World War II, and sterilizations continued in some states well into the 1970s. Tens of thousands of Americans who were deemed unfit to reproduce were operated on against their will or without their consent. Now, some of those victims are still alive today, and many want justice. So far, all they've gotten is a handful of official apologies. One state, North Carolina, promised nearly a decade ago to compensate victims. But years later, we've discovered those victims are still waiting. Elizabeth Cohen has more.
At the time, I couldn't do nothing about it.
October 22nd, 1968. Charles Holt was 19 at the time, living in an institution for boys in Butner, North Carolina, when his life was drastically changed, without his consent.
They sent me to Rex Hospital, and then they just pushed me in a room and just gave me some kind of gas. I just went off sleep. Then when I woke up from it, I noticed something was wrong, and they told me what they'd done, and I wasn't a happy camper.
What they had done was surgery, a vasectomy to make him sterile. But why? It turns out the order came from the state, which said he was feeble-minded and unworthy of having children.
The goal of eugenics was to improve the human race by enticing young people to make better decisions on who they marry and reproduce with. The plan was to eliminate feeble-mindedness that led to crimes, and since research at the time suggested that crime was most often brought on by poverty, the poor would be forcibly sterilized to protect the future generations against such situations. Mentally handicapped people were also viewed as feeble-minded, and they were often sterilized against their will as well. The eugenics movement can be traced directly to Darwinism, which was the first instance of people forming the idea that they can control who can reproduce and who cannot. The most prominent eugenicist was Charles Benedict Davenport, a Harvard PhD that later became a lead researcher in evolution. Along with Davenport was David Starr Jordan, a biologist and chancellor of Stanford University, and Dr. W. Mott, a leading expert in insanity. Many geneticists, such as H.J. Mueller, supported this triumvirate of scientists. Dissent of eugenics was widespread, portraying it as an abortion and sterilization of the unfit to try to stop the movement. One such opposer was G.K. Chancellor, a public activist in Great Britain. All 50 American states have some form of controlling genetics even today, in one way or another. However, even the start of the movement, during its most extreme period, all existing states had laws allowing eugenics. However, some states were more prominent in their support and execution of the movement. In 1907, Indiana was the first state to allow eugenics, such as sterilization. In 1911, New Jersey, Washington, California, and Connecticut followed suit. These states allowed vasectomies and tubectomies without consent of the patients, sometimes without the patient even being made aware before the operation would be taking place. Throughout the history of eugenics in the U.S., over 60,000 people have been sterilized against their will. 902 patients alone have been sterilized in Nebraska, with 53% of women and 80% being diagnosed with mentally ill or feeble-mindedness. So how did this incredibly extreme idea make its way into the hearts and minds of Americans? The answer is quite simple. The Americans at the time believed in the idea of utopia, where every human had ideal genes. So, with this in mind, could an extreme eugenics movement ever rise again in America? Well, it's quite possible. Now new technology could lead to a different form of eugenics. We are currently able to interpret human genes and deduce what diseases are caused by what genes, and what genes make up susceptible to certain illness. There are also ways for parents to alter their embryos, with genetics being able to decipher what possible embryo will be the healthiest, and even going as far as to influence the gender of the child. This new research and technology has the potential to lead the world with no disease, mental illness, or physical defects. So is this a bad thing? The popular opinion right now is no, not with proper moderation and control. The general thought is that as long as the new form of eugenics is kept under control, we could provide ourselves with a better future.
Science that eugenicists of the 20th century could only have dreamed of appear in our news every single day.
Of stem cell research
and picking the genes of our children.
Cloning of embryos for their destruction.
They've discovered stem cells in a new place.
The embryo has a genetic disease.
Genetic test. Is it a danger? It's always a danger when there are technologies that can be used and abused. And I think that the history of the eugenics movement tells us when a technology actually exists, people will try to use it, sometimes for reasons it was never intended to be used.
With the mapping of the human genome, prenatal testing, implantation genetic diagnosis, therapeutic cloning, and stem cell therapy, we find ourselves entering a promising world of genetic medicine. It is with this great power, however, that comes the need for even greater responsibility, sensitivity, and accountability.
Humanity truly does now possess a powerful tool for good. However, we must heed the warnings sounded by the coercive legislation and beliefs of the eugenics movement before we may venture into the frontier of modern genetic medicine. Tragedy may very well give way to triumph, but how that will be recorded in the history books of tomorrow will be determined by our actions today.
From Health Academy News, this is Rachel Love signing out.